Well, hello everybody, and welcome back to Julie's Orchids. At work the other day, one of my colleagues gave me a question about orchid care. So one of my work colleagues has recently purchased a home here in Perth, and I gifted them one of my orchids as a housewarming present to them, and they've been managing to keep that orchid going. And so my work colleague has asked if there's any specific care that they need to do now that we in the Southern Hemisphere are transitioning from summer to fall. The 17th, I believe, is the autumn equinox here in the Southern Hemisphere. So I thought this would be a good time to address my work colleague's question. My work colleague also happens to be a subscriber, so thank you very much. And well, my work colleague's question has to do with Phalaenopsis orchids, because I gave him a Phalaenopsis orchids when him and his family purchased a home here in Perth. And specifically, he got a Phalaenopsis style Phalaenopsis as opposed to a polychilous style Phalaenopsis. So we're going to be discussing Phalaenopsis, otherwise known as your big box store phals. These are the phals that you'll find at your big box stores, local grocery stores. So here in Australia, you'll find them at Bunnings. In the States, I believe you will have them at Lowe's and Home Depot, possibly Menards. And well, let's get into it because fall is rapidly approaching here in the Southern Hemisphere. And there's a few little changes that we'll need to make. So now with our Phalaenopsis style Phalaenopsis, these can kind of grow all year long if you grow them indoors like I do. So the trick is for you to figure out when they're done growing and are resting. So they're pretty easy to figure out. I've got examples here of a plant that is in full resting mode and one that is still growing but is not growing roots. But we can see we've got a new leaf forming right here. So I'm going to discuss the care that I'm going to give this plant here, which is still very obviously in active growth because you can see that it's putting out this nice juicy green new leaf right there. The root tips have all closed up. You don't have any green growing root tips, and that's okay. Down here we do have some green growing root tips, so this plant still is in active growth. So despite the fact that we are coming into fall, this plant is very heavily in active growth. I'm going to continue treating this plant as if it is in active growth, so it's going to continue to get its fertilizing, its calcium, magnesium. What I am going to do is I'm going to hold off on the seaweed. So the seaweed is the hormones that kind of get the plant to realize it's waking up, it's time to start really growing a lot of stuff. So I'm going to continue giving it the fertilizer and the calcium and magnesium, but it will not receive any more seaweed. At this point in time, while it is still in active growth, it is going to maintain receiving the calcium, magnesium, and the fertilizer at the same parts per million when it's scheduled for them to have it. So as you know, I do them on rotating weekends. So the first weekend of the month, they get fertilizer. Second weekend of the month, they get calcium, magnesium. Third weekend of the month, they'll get either flushed, depending on if they're in growing or not, or they'll get some seaweed. And then the fourth weekend of the month, they get flushed. This one is in active growth. We've got new leaf growing. No active root trips on the aerial roots, but down in the pot, we've got active green growing root tips. So this plant, for now, is going to be treated just like it has been through the whole growing season. Even though it's coming into fall and autumn, this plant here is still in active growth. And now we'll look at Phalaeopsis. Phalaeopsis I put into this skull because I thought it was kind of cute. It is a little bit hard to see the growing root tips inside of the pot. The roots that I can see inside of the pot, I do not see any growing root tips on. Likewise, the aerial roots out here, the green growing root tips have sealed off. The new leaf has grown to its mature size. So this plant is now resting. And I'm going to treat this plant in the manner as such that it is resting. So pretty well until I start to see some green growing root tips or signs of new growth, I'm just going to give this plant water. I might every here and again give it a very, very low dose of calcium, magnesium, and fertilizer, but it will not get any seaweed at all whatsoever. Now, if you've got your big box store Phalaenopsis planted up and you don't use liquid fertilizer, but you do use the slow release fertilizer pellets, that's fine. Leave everything as is. Don't add any more fertilizer pellets until you start seeing new signs of active growth come the springtime. What I am going to do, and what I do try to do at spring and at fall, is to do some preventative pest maintenance. And for this, I'm going to show you how I create my garlic alcohol. This is a variation on a recipe that I've gotten from Nina over at Ninja Orchids. Her recipe, my recipe, the only difference is she uses dish soap and I'm using liquid paraffin wax. There's really no big difference. Sometimes I use the dish soap, sometimes I use the paraffin wax. Today I'm using the dish soap. I'm not using the dish soap because I have ran out of dish soap, but I've got liquid paraffin and that'll do just fine. So we're going to move the phals out of the way and we're going to bring our supplies in here. Now you can also use fresh garlic. I'm opting for the canned garlic and it's in water and it's already finely crushed. Why am I opting for that? Frankly, because I'm lazy. I can't be messed with squeezing it. I get it in water because I don't want the oil. You can get this pre-crushed garlic in oil. I'm getting it in water because I don't want to have any more oil in this other than the garlic's oil that's going to come out through the water. I find that when you use the pre-mashed garlic in water, you don't have to do the 24-hour sit overnight. You only need a couple 4 hours for all of this to go. So here's the recipe. It's quite simple. It's 2 to 1. So if you use 100 mils of 70% isopropyl rubbing alcohol, the closest I can get in Australia is 64%. But we're talking 70%. So if you've got the 90%, you're going to need to dilute it quite a bit more. But what we have here is going to be a 2 to 1 ratio. So 100 mils isopropyl rubbing alcohol to 200 mils reverse osmosis water. And I've already got my 200 mils of reverse osmosis water in my spray bottle. And all I'm going to need to do is to top it up from the 200 mark to the 300 mark with the isopropyl rubbing alcohol. And I don't imagine that that's going to be very exciting viewing on the YouTube. So I'm not going to do the whole thing on it. But this is, whoop, that didn't quite work the way I planned. So hopefully we have 100 mils left in this. I'll have to talk to that. I've never had that happen before. Maybe you should put on some gloves when doing this, because that just happened and I had a little cut in my hand and it's a little bit sore. So I've taken it from 200 to 300 and I'm going to put the lid back on my isopropyl rubbing alcohol. Now the next thing that I'm going to do is open up my garlic. And for 300 mils of liquid, I'm going to do pretty well a heaping baby teaspoonful of garlic and just let that plop right on down in there. And then you don't want to use too much of the liquid paraffin. Just like the dish soap, a little bit will do. So I've got a little pipette, and I typically put just like as much as I can pull out in the pipette in my mixture. So right about that amount on in. And then we're just going to make sure that we get these little bits of garlic off the top. I get the spray bottle that has the sort of mesh over the top, because I find the ones that just have it like that, you end up sucking up the bits of garlic. So if you look at your spray bottle nozzle and make sure that it's got the little mesh on the bottom versus it just like that, you will appreciate that and you won't suck up any of the garlic pieces while you're spraying. So we're just going to put this right on in there. Tighten that up, give it a bit of a shake, and from here on out, it's going to sit in the fridge for 3 or 4 hours so that all of those garlic juices can get mixed in with that alcohol. And we'll be back in a couple hours, and then I've set it out so it's not freezing cold, fridge cold. It's more room temperature, because you don't want to put cold on your plants. These are tropical plants. They don't like cold. So I've let it sit in the fridge for a couple hours and then come back to room temperature. And it's really this simple. I suggest you do this early in the day. You just are going to spray everything down. Make sure you get underneath sides of the leaves. With the Phalaenopsis style Phalaenopsis, the earlier in the day you do this, the better, because they breathe from the underneath sides of the leaves at night, and this can clog them up a little bit. But the whole gist is just to spray all of the plant, and the paraffin wax leaves a slight film that holds the garlic oil on. And the garlic oil is sort of an insecticide and a miticide, and it helps to deter the pests from coming. It's natural, so it's not as hard on the environment. I don't know, I haven't read any studies that have done anything on if pests can get immunity to the portions in the garlic that work for this recipe, but they certainly can become immune to over-the-counter pesticides. So this is what I do to help mitigate pests through the change of the season. The reason why I do that here in Perth is I find that as we go from summer to fall, the bugs and stuff, they try to come in, just like they do back home where in Illinois, where it gets very cold in the wintertime. When it starts getting warmer, they try to go to where the warmth is when it's getting cold outside, and that's inside the house. So I find that this as a preventative treatment at the change of each season, you know, from summer to fall, winter to spring, helps mitigate some of the pests. And again, I suggest doing any of these treatments as early in the day as possible so they have as much airflow around them to get the liquid portions of this to dry off. Now, the alcohol helps that as well, but you still can get rot and damage if you do this really late at night. So when you do your pest treatment with your garlic alcohol, do it as early in the day as possible. Well, there you go. Some guidelines for kind of how to take care of your Phalaenopsis orchids as we're changing seasons. For growers indoors of the Phalaenopsis, it might not so much be a big deal as the change of season other than watching your plant. If your plant is very obviously in active growth, meaning you can see new leaf growth and you can see green growing root tips, it's actively growing, it needs the fertilizer, it needs the calcium, magnesium, and it needs the seaweed. If it is completely dormant, meaning there's no growing root tips, there's no new leaves growing, and it's resting, you can just dial everything way down or just rely on water only until you start seeing the next signs of growth of the plant waking up, which would usually be the start of new root nubbins coming from the base of the plant. All right, guys, I thank you very much for watching. If you liked the video, please give me a thumbs up. A subscribe would be appreciated. And you guys have yourselves a fabulous day.